The anthropologists and then those people, they say that the Diné came from the north. There is not any one story in the traditional teachings of Diné that say we came from that direction. In the telling of the emergence story, when the Diné, in the actual life here on the surface of Mother Earth, they came from the east and came into this area. And many native people, when they tell about their origin, they always say that they came from the direction east and that the holy people brought them to this part of the world. And that when the holy people left, they promised that one day we will come back and we will come from that direction to be with you. And so that was the understanding. And so the Diné also had the story of coming from the east. But if any of you have noticed that the anthropologists and then those people, they say that the Diné came from the north. There is not any one story in the traditional teachings of Diné that say we came from that direction. It's always that people went in that direction to the north. People went to the west, and people went south, and people went in different directions. But they never ever arrived here coming from the north, except maybe small groups, because in the telling of the story, when they came from the east and they came into this part of the continent, they encountered mountains, very high mountains, and they referred to them as Topataiskit. And that's very important to understand that word, because a lot of times people don't understand Topataiskit. It's saying like a mound of water. And that's what snow is. When snow settles on top of the mountains, it is a mound of water, because when it melts, that's when the rivers start to flow. And that's where you get the story of the rivers flowing in the four directions. And so this happened probably around the present-day southern Colorado, after they had come west, and they encountered the mountains, and they identified the Topataiskit, or the mountains, with the snow piled on top of them, and the rivers flowing out of the mountains in the four directions. But the two main rivers, of course, is the one that is known as the Rio Grande, and then the other one, the Colorado. But the story of the early Diné, they talk about along those rivers, there were people that lived there. Later on, those people became known as Tsajikin, or Bekintachini, or Tanne Diné. There were so many different names in that of some of the groups. But today, we still have the group of people that are named Tsajikin by clan, and Bekintachini, and some of the others that were encountered along the river in those very early times, which is probably almost 2,000 years ago when the Diné first came into the area. But the reason I point this out is because it's very important when you listen to the emergence story. That's the very first thing that they talk about, and the four rivers, and then the people they encountered, and then the very first story of Trotting Coyote has a setting up in the area probably east of Moab, Utah, and up toward Grand Junction, Colorado. That's the very first setting of the Trotting Coyote story, the very first one. And that is that after Coyote was given the authority to have control of the weather, he's trotting along, and it's a very hot day. And if you've ever been out in that area, south of the Book Cliff, you know how desolate that is. how dry it is. But just a few thousand feet, or a few thousand feet to the north, you have that ridge, the Book Cliffs, and on top of that is mountainous country. But the story about the first trotting coyote is where he is trotting along and he wishes that there was a cloud above him. And in Navajo he says, "Costa," and he gets the cloud, and then he asks for a little bit more and a little bit more, and pretty soon a thunderstorm happens, and then it floods the area, and he comes in contact with his cousin Skunk, and him and Skunk devise a plan that Skunk will go tell all of the rabbits and all of the prairie dogs that the coyote has died, and in it they refer to Diné. And he says, "Go and tell them Diné is dead." And so he does, and all of the rabbits and the prairie dog come around to dance and watch and see this dead coyote. And so as they come around and they gather around, so the little skunk cousin puts his rear end up into the air and sprays his chemical into the air, and it blinds everybody. And then him and Coyote, they club the rabbits and the prairie dogs, and then eventually they put them into the ground to roast them to eat. But Coyote, he wants them all for himself. And so he talks the little coyote cousin into having a race with him. And so this is the very important part, because in the traditional way that the story is told, Coyote challenges his little skunk cousin. He says, "We're going to race. Whoever it wins gets all of the prairie dogs and the rabbits." And so a little skunk agrees. And Coyote says, "See those 5 mountains over there? Just let's fly." He says, "I'm going to give you a head start. When you get to those mountains," he says, "you make a fire. So when I see the smoke, then I'll take off." And so little skunk said, "Okay." But little skunk went a little ways and he found another cousin, the badger. He said, "Would you do me a big favor?" He said, "When you get on the other side of that mountain, make a fire." And so the badger agreed. And so the fire was made, and then Coyote back over here saw the smoke, and he took off. And as he ran toward the mountain, little skunk was hiding and saw him go by, and then little skunk comes back and digs up the rabbits and the prairie dogs and hauls it off into the rock, high up in the rocks. And Coyote, of course, completes his race after he runs to the sky and comes back and finds that the prairie dogs and the rabbits have been dug up, and he tracks his cousin Skunk out to the rocks, and he sees him way up there, and he stands down at the bottom and he says, that means, "Cousin, please give me back some of that food." And he throws him a bone. But the main important thing is those 5 mountains that was told in the original way that the story is told, the Lasalle. And those today are identified as the Lasalle Mountains, and they are located east of the Moab, Utah. But that's the very first trotting coyote story of the emergence.